Moving on next to Mars, this could be a book, but I will try to keep it to not a book. Mars used to be a moon of Tiamat, also known as Maldek, which is the planet that is now the asteroid belt. We will talk about that in a minute, but it used to be very Earth-like, oceany, jungle-y, and habitable. It is still loosely, very loosely fits the definition of habitable, but it is certainly not hospitable or nice. And you can't really breathe the air without a mask, unless you're literally just sitting down. Except in some places where there is dense foliage, and that kind of makes up for it, because, you know, plants put off oxygen, so that makes it a little bit better. And it is very cold. Nowadays, it was starting to get back on its feet after the Orion Wars, which is when Tiamat was destroyed, Mars was nuked and lost its atmosphere, or lost most of its atmosphere, and all of that. It was starting to get back on its feet before 1945. The date was, I believe, exactly May 28, 1945, when the Germans fleeing Terra showed up and annexed Mars in its entirety, and began the period between 1945 and 1990, so 45 years of civil war, sectarian violence, Cold War, and genocide that the indigenous of Mars now refer to as the Black Terror, when the Germans assaulted cities and everywhere that they wanted for themselves, killing untold numbers of people, both the indigenous human Martians, who they killed about 70% of, as well as the Martian sectoids, or Martian mantids, which are more ant-like than mantis-like, but people call them mantids. They killed about 30% of them, and they killed about 15% of the Martian indigenous raptors, which were very much like the ones in Jurassic Park. They destroyed not only cities, they destroyed many holy sites. They forced the extinction of numerous cultural practices, such as, not being nomadic. They made the Martian indigenous nomadic because they kept coming in and taking over their territories. Before that, they were not a nomadic people. Many dialects of the various languages spoken on Mars died, as well as many other pieces of what the United Nations calls intangible heritage. And they themselves also took many losses. This ended in 1990 with the Treaty of Neu-Berlin, so that there is now only a Cold War on Mars, although there are still skirmishes. But it will be probably at least centuries before Mars is ever recovered from those 45 years. It's insane.
You said that before 1945, Mars was starting to get back on its feet. What was going on there?
I don't know all the details really, but there was a lot of rebuilding happening. Martian indigenous humans were beginning to rebuild like actual cities, rather than just settlements. The mantids were regaining a lot of influence, and they still are to an extent, but nowhere near to the point where they had been. The terraforming project to make Mars a paradise again was underway, and that ended. So, yeah, basically that's what was going on.
What do we know about the human contacts with the Martians prior to 1945, both in recent era and in the ancient times?
Prior to 45, people weren't going to Mars that much, even with the technology, because Mars is not a hospitable or a nice place in general in the wilderness. But there was some visitation. There were like little archaeological expeditions and what have you, but not that much. In ancient times, there was a lot, way back during the Lyran Empire era, when the solar system was part of Lyran Empire, when Mars was a moon of Tiamat. There was a lot of contact between Earth and Mars. They were very interconnected. You know, people would commute back and forth on the daily. And that was a common thing. And that was a very different time, obviously. But we don't know all that much. At least I don't, personally. I'm sure there are other people who could tell you a lot more. Jack Flynn, for example, could tell you a lot more. But, yeah.
Did the Germans also go back in time on Mars to establish colonies? And if yes, to what periods? How does this process work? Do these settlements just appear in the present once they're created in the past?
Yeah, they did. I know that they had I remember going on a mission to Mars in about 1840, and they were already somewhat established. So yeah, they had gone back at least that far. But that was after the war and everything that they started doing that. It's confusing. You'll go insane if you ask those questions too much. How does this process work? Do these settlements just appear in the present once they're created in the past? Yeah, pretty much. They have a chronovisor-like thing. They can look into the past and they will find the most advantageous for them time in a planet's history, or a region's history, or whatever, whenever they want to go settle. And then they just jump back using hyperspace to that period and start building a colony. And yeah, they do pretty much just appear, along with, you know, their history and all the people who live there and everything else, to the people in the present. It's very possible to go to sleep. If you're a colonial, it's very possible to go to sleep and wake up and find suddenly a new politically important colony that's 600 years old that you never knew about. You know, that happens. It's just a part of life.
You said that 5 million Germans died in the 1945-1990 war. How many people did they bring to Mars originally? Where did they get more people afterwards?
Originally, first batch in 45 was, I think, 300,000 or thereabouts. And about half of those people died within 5 years or so, because it was so bad. It was not only the war, there was also the whole, it being incredibly inhospitable. You know, they couldn't get food to grow for several years and so forth. It was not pleasant. Where did they get more people? From the past. Or else. They went into the past, they started getting people who had died. By that point they had regen tanks, and they started getting people who had died. And they kept going further and further into the past to gather these people, which was, it made it difficult for them to live with these people who when they reached a certain point, they could no longer understand what each other was saying. So they started just making little enclave communities of them, and placing them in different places around Mars, along with written instructions on what to do with the equipment they were left with. But anyways, how they got these people, they went after plague victims, and they went after people who had died in genocides, and they went after people who had died in wars. They very specifically avoided women who had died in childbirth, because that was a genetic defect, and still is a genetic defect that they do not want within their population. So they went after those sorts of things. Oh, they went after women who had been killed during witch hunts. That was a big thing, because those women were overwhelmingly just, you know, psychic, and that society didn't know how to handle it. So they would go and get them. Part of me kind of wonders if maybe they're time travelers going and influencing the past is the reason why beheading was such a popular execution method in Europe for such a long time. Because, you know, then they would have the brain stem and the brain. They could just go in and grab the head, and that would be that. And they would have that person.
Do you know about the American and Russian soldiers and workers that Germans received yearly under a treaty with the Earth elite? Where did these people go?
I think you're probably talking about the brain drain. The brain drain people, for the most part, went outside the solar system, or some of them wound up on Titan, but most of them wound up on Centurion, Vega Prime, and various and sundry other luxurious planets. They didn't really wind up on Mars. Soldiers wound up wherever they were needed after being enhanced, of course. But so yeah, plenty of them wound up on Mars. Although Russians I don't think wound up on Mars very much for whatever reason. I don't know. But I don't recall seeing very many there. Most of the Russians I remember seeing were on ships, or doing colonial security in places here and there. So I guess that answers that.
I thought the Draco leased some of the Martian territory to the Germans. What was the Draco's reaction to their appropriation of the whole planet?
Oh, they were fucking fuming about it. They were really angry. And yes, you're correct. They did only lease parts of it, but the Germans showed up, and being what they are, they said, you know, everything the light touches is our kingdom, or whatever, you know, to make a Lion King reference. So yeah, the Draco were quite upset about it, but also they were low-key kind of impressed about it. They were like, okay, you're learning how to play the game, which was probably part of why they had hired them and invited them in the first place. But, you know, in the real ways they were ticked off, but they couldn't really do much of anything. Or they could have, but they decided not to, so. But it did strain diplomatic relations, definitely.
What was the indigenous Martian civilization like prior to the war? What was your experience with them?
Okay, prior to the war, well, if you go into ancient history, they were a thriving spacefaring civilization up until probably about 10,000 years ago or so, when there were various things which went down that caused them to lose their technology, and they were very slowly recovering from that until the war, and the war decimated their population and it forced them to become nomadic. They had never been nomadic before that, but that's a whole other story. Their language, yes, it is basically Sumerian, although it's evolved quite a lot, of course, in the intervening years, so it's kind of similar to Hungarian, but it's also tonal. We'll probably never know whether the original Sumerian was tonal or not, because, you know, there's no one alive who speaks it in the way that people spoke it back then. But there are 12 tones. 12. Yeah, if you thought Mandarin was hard. Yeah. Their writing, I've not come across any writing on Earth that looks exactly like it. The closest I've seen is actually the Manchu script, but even that is still not that close. I do know of a person who writes in it on occasion. Somewhere I should still have one of the texts that she wrote out. I translated it actually for her, which is interesting. I can read it, but I can't speak the language anymore. But I can still read it for whatever reason, I guess, because visual memory. What cultural similarities did I share with the Terrans? I guess their closest cultural relatives would be probably some of the Native American tribes, and possibly some of the people of the very ancient Middle East. I'm sure of that, actually, because of their artistic style is very ancient Middle Eastern / Egyptian. What was my experience with them? It depends. At times we were fighting them, but there were other times where I was being friends with them. I would, on occasion, for diplomatic reasons, go live with them for a time, particularly when I was learning their language. I went to live with them for probably 8 months. 8 Martian months, I should say, which is actually quite a bit longer than 8 Earth months. And they were quite decent people, I found. Albeit they weren't all that trusting of me or of other colonists, but they were loosening up a little bit. I remember their food was pretty decent. They grow berries underground. They have some method that no one has ever been able to quite figure out of growing fruit, certain fruits underground that do not naturally grow underground. And so they had good fruits. They cook and eat the spiders, which is unfortunate because those spiders are sentient, but they cook and eat them, and they are quite delicious. They taste like lobster. So they do have some technology. They have like crystals, little crystal pyramids. They never lost that technology for whatever reason. And those will store information forever, literally forever, because, you know, crystals don't go bad. At least those types don't. Yeah, I think that's about it.
If the human Martians have the same genetic makeup as Terrans, do we know who originated where, and which group was later brought to either Earth or Mars? Have there been marriages between the colonists and the locals in the new era?
As far as people have been able to determine, like archaeologists, you know, real archaeologists and like SSP archaeologists who have access to both Earth and Mars, humans were on Earth slightly first. However, the Anunnaki immediately started taking them to Mars for slave labor, further slave labor. So, yeah, that answers that part. Have there been marriages between the colonists and the locals in the new era? Do any of them get integrated into the colonies, or the colonists go over to their settlements to live? More for the first one than the second one. They'll let you live with them for diplomatic purposes, but if you marry one of them, it's culturally expected for that person to leave, rather than for the colonist to move in with them. But yes, there have been marriages between colonists and indigenous Martians. It's not common by any stretch, because you're They're still not very likely to meet. In fact, they're probably even less likely to meet after the war because of how segregated society has become. But, like, there's no laws against them marrying, so it does happen.
What other human and non-human races on Mars are known, besides the dark-skinned humans, the insectoids, and the raptors?
Those are the indigenous ones. There are plenty of other people who have set up shop on Mars. Of course, there's us. There's also a Draco community. There's an Anunnaki community. There's a sizable Rigelian community, interestingly. Let's see. There's a lot of Imperial Mantids. Imperial Mantids, of course, being the ones who look like praying mantises, not Mars Mantids. Okay, yeah.
Are the spiders a separate and sentient race that had their own territory?
They're essentially the guard dogs of the Mars Mantids. They engineered them to be that. They are a little bit sentient. They are more sentient than our dogs, certainly. But no, they don't have their own territory and they don't have any independence. They're basically cattle. Although there are feral ones who have, you know, escaped as animals will and have gone out, but they don't have territory as such. They're just wild.
What prominent German and other groups' colonies can be mentioned on Mars? What is the population in some of them? Can you generally describe the one that you're most familiar with?
The main German one is Neu-Berlin, which is underneath Olympus Mons. It has a population of about 2 million people. That's the biggest one. And the second biggest one would probably be New Kanazawa, which is Japanese. It's in the Elysium Planitia region, in the Green Belt. It has a population of about 1.25 million. Martian colonies are generally quite small, usually around less than 50,000 in most of them. There are Argentine colonies near the German ones. There's at least one Taiwanese colony. I don't know the names of these places. It's all visual, but I do know they exist. The one I'm most familiar with would be Neu-Berlin, because I've lived there a few times. It's basically just a very cyberpunkish city. However, the center of it is a replica of Albert Speer's vision for what he would have turned Berlin into eventually. And they also kept some of the old buildings, so it's a mixture in the center. Around the edges is where people live and everything. And it's mansions and big giant corporate buildings with the various German corporations.
When did the rest of the Earth nations start setting up colonies there? Did they have to lease space from the Germans? Were there groups who were more friendly with the Martians from the beginning?
It's been gradual. The first ones after the Germans to settle there were the Japanese, and then not long after that, the Taiwanese, as well as a couple of other European countries. I know there were some Hungarians who were brought on pretty early, because this is before Hungary became part of the Eastern Bloc in '56. Let's see. I know the Argentines got brought on before the Americans. I don't know the exact year. The Americans got brought on in '53, and with them came all the NATO countries, pretty much, as well as some other prominent Western Bloc countries, such as South Vietnam, Australia, etc. in the mid-50s. Going up through to the early 60s, they were bringing on Western Bloc countries in droves, who then all immediately, well, not all of them, but a lot of them then immediately left Mars to go to somewhere less unpleasant and settle. The Eastern Bloc countries started in probably about 60 or 61. Trying to remember. Yeah, thereabouts is when Russia, Poland, and so on started coming on board. And yes, they all had lease space from the Germans and give them a quota of personnel, which is part of why they started leaving Mars pretty quickly, because they didn't like having to give up their people as workers and what have you. Were there groups who were more friendly with the Martians from the beginning? Yeah. Of all people, the Argentines. It's hilarious, you know, the one country that's really good at pissing people off was, for whatever reason, got along really well with the Martians.
What is the relationship between the Earth corporations and the Mars Defense Force with the Germans on Mars?
Okay, the Mars Defense Force is the Germans. Marsische Heimscheld. Mars Defense Force is their little American auxiliary. There is no independent organization known as Mars Defense Force. And if people think that, then they are lying to themselves, or they have been duped, in my opinion. I try not to ever claim that I'm right about anything, so I'm just going to say that's, from what I've seen, that's how it looks to me. But between the Earth corporations and the Germans, that's kind of a weird one. They're kind of like the mafia, I guess, where it's like, you stay on your turf, we'll stay on ours, and no one has to get hurt. But the minute anyone crosses any lines, they immediately get into massive fights. That's how it usually goes down. So, but yeah, and there are some that they work closely with, such as Arasaka Robotics, and they work closely with Mars Corporation, the food company, which is actually secretly headquartered on Mars, the planet. And that's where Mars bars originate from. You know, everybody's favorite candy, I guess. Which is funny. Which is interesting when you think about it, actually, because, you know, why was it ever a Mars bar? Well, because it comes from Mars. They work closely with those guys, but otherwise it's a mafia-ish kind of arrangement.
What is the Olympus Mons Treaty of 1990, and what are its main stipulations? Has the treaty been duly adhered to?
The Olympus Mons Treaty of 1990 is what ended the Black Terror. Its main stipulations are basically that everyone gets their own territory, which cannot be impeded on Mars, and that they are free to pursue their own destinies, I believe is the exact language that was used. So, has it been duly adhered to? For the most part, except for against the Mars native raptors. People just really hate anything with scaly skin. I don't agree with that. I think it's frankly kind of disgusting, but that is the general attitude. So the Mars raptors are still being killed off. Much more covert now, but it's still happening.
You said that the treaty ensured that all sides would be exempt from prosecution for genocide. Which authority would implement such prosecution? Were there any third parties / organizations mediating the treaty? Were any other Earth nations among the signees? Were there Draco or any other races among the signees or guarantees of the treaty?
The Draco Empire was the one mediating the treaty because Mars is their territory. Even though they kind of don't really give a shit what goes on there, they also sort of do. It's complicated, but because it is still on paper their territory, they were the ones signing or overseeing the signing of the treaty. Oh, and by the way, the Draco would also be the one to implement any prosecutions. Yeah. And were there any other Earth nations among the signees? Yeah, Argentina was there. There is, I've mentioned earlier, there is a pretty big Argentine community on Mars. The Japanese were there. Let's see, the Americans were there. At least some faction of Americans were there. What else? I remember that the Vietnamese were there. The Vietnamese breakaway group, which is South Vietnam in space. It's no connection to the Hanoi government. It's the Saigon government. I think that about covers it.
Do you know of any politicians from Earth that played a role in the Martian affairs? Were there any Nazi leaders that moved to Mars after the war?
I know the Clintons were involved. The Clintons were involved heavily. There are even like songs about it from resistance fighters or from Germans about how awful the Clintons were. They showed up in probably the late 70s or early 80s with Raytheon as the various corporations were getting involved. Let's see, there are plenty of celebrities and politicians who secretly have investments or whatever with some of the various corporations. I know that there is a certain rather far-right nutjob senator from Florida known as Matt Gaetz. I know he has a tie-in to one of the companies. I'd have to go back into my notes and check, but he has a tie-in to one of the corporations, and I know he was seen on Mars occasionally. There were people who were probably European politicians based on like how they dressed and everything. I just don't know European politicians very well, but I would see them on delegation ships coming and going, and you could kind of tell what someone was by how they dressed. And so they were politicians, and they were, I'm pretty sure, Europeans, but I don't know their names. Oh, and did any Nazi leaders move there after the war? I believe that one of the children of the Goebbels family who was supposedly killed, the boy, the youngest, I know that he moved there after the war ended.
Has there been any friendly exchange and/or cooperation between the Germans and the Martian races since the Olympus Mons Treaty?
Plenty. They've been trading technology. I already mentioned how people at the diplomatic school are now going to live with Martians, Martian indigenous humans for a while to learn their language, and they would only even need to do that if these Martian indigenous humans were politically relevant now. So, yeah, there's been cooperation and friendly exchange.
Can you talk about the diplomatic school? What did Heinrich study? What was his life like there? Were there only German students at the school? Is this where their foreign ministry is located?
It was an add-on to the Universität Massische Heimscheld. Yeah, that's a mouthful. It's near Neu-Berlin. It's at the base that Penny refers to as Aris Prima. I don't remember that name, but I don't remember any name, so I will go with that being the correct name. And compared to military schools on Earth, certainly, it's actually fairly luxurious. Even for like the infantry people, it's pretty nice. You get like very generously sized bunks, or if you have a patron or if you happen to be rich, you can get a private room, but that's not common. Although you can rent out a room for an hour or so to be with your significant other. So, his life was pretty alright. What it looks like a very futuristic university. There's a lot of glass and chrome everywhere. There's a lot of VR learning and stuff like that, and it's comfortable. They spared no expense on that school, and it is kind of the flagship school of the entire SSP, which answers the next part of were there only Germans at the school? God, no, it was huge and international. Is this where their foreign ministry is located? No, the Germans' foreign ministry is located on Centurion. They would not put it on what is still, in spite of improvements and everything, still a pretty impoverished wasteland of a planet. They put it on their flagship planet. And, what did Heinrich study? He studied diplomacy. How to talk to people, how to be good at it, how to protect yourself, how to protect your nation, how to get along with people who you have absolutely nothing whatsoever in common with, and also about different species, and how to get along with them. Some of their languages sometimes, although not usually. He would usually fall back on telepathic contact, and also, if need be, how to kill them. That was what Heinrich studied, was aliens, pretty much.
If Mars is so inhospitable, what would be its main strategic and economic significance for so many groups? What are some of the major industries on Mars?
To put it bluntly, it's a bit of a dick measuring contest. It's like, basically, we've managed to eke out an existence and thrive on this inhospitable planet that nobody cares about and no one wants, and all of that, look at how amazing we are, basically. And I do have to admit it is quite impressive, and it does make them look good. So, yeah, that would be it, really. And also there are a lot of ancient sites there. A lot of ancient sites that are still pretty off the books, so it's not that hard to find a new one and keep it to yourself and loot it and everything. What are some of the major industries on Mars? Gun production is a huge one, as well as food production, interestingly enough. Several, actually, Earth companies have offices on Mars. We've mentioned Mars Corporation, also Mondelez. The company has some there. It's also where they make food replicators, which are made by Mondelez. So they also do make some movies there, but it's not really the main thing there. The main movie-making place is New Atlantis.
What are some of the major cultural and historical sites on Mars? Are there pyramids or other ruins with names that everybody knows about, like Giza or Teotihuacan?
There are, I just don't remember the names. But yeah, there's a major site of pyramids that were built by the people from Tiamat back when it was still around. There are a number of underground cities that were abandoned by the indigenous and have since been basically just left intact pretty much, and are now becoming tourist sites.
Is anyone working on restoring and preserving the Martial cultural heritage?
I know there's a couple of German NGOs who are doing that, and I think there's at least one Japanese NGO doing that, and there are other groups of the indigenous who are doing that to restore some of their stuff. Oh, one site I do want to mention, a little bit north of the equator, I can't remember the name of the region, but it's a pretty big area, several hundred square miles, that is, or was, a massive, massive ship graveyard for ancient alien craft that parked out in the desert and were just kind of left there. Of course, any of the technology that was in them has been looted and is completely gone. However, the husks of the ship and the appearances are left intact, and it's really an amazing place to go and wander around in. I've been there a couple of times, but again, I don't know what that place is called, but it is really cool and amazing.
How long is a day and a year on Mars? If it's significantly longer than on Earth, how does it affect the daily schedule?
A day on Mars is about 24.5 hours, so that's not too big of a difference, really. How does it affect the daily schedule? Well, it doesn't too much. However, one thing that does change is the calendar, because a year on Mars is 687 days. So that's... you only celebrate your birthday nearly every almost 2 years, 2 Earth years. And so their calendar is quite different. I can't remember how many months they put in a year on a Martian calendar, but it's a different number. And by the way, the Martian calendar is what's standard also on ships, interestingly enough.
What are the fauna of Mars that stands out? And how much of the surface is inhabited by animal life? Are there zoos on Mars, and what can be seen in them? Are there nature preserves for the local fauna?
The fauna that stands out is basically the giant insects and lizards and such. Everyone talks about the spiders, and yeah, they're definitely a thing, but that's far from the only thing. There are also giant scorpions, giant centipedes, humongous grasshoppers, although they are harmless, thankfully, and there's really huge rhinoceros beetles, too, and they're also harmless. They're actually quite friendly, the rhinoceros beetles. Quite friendly. They're kind of like Martian deer. You know, they'll follow you around and they'll come up and like eat out of your hands and stuff. It's really funny. How much of the surface is inhabited by animal life? I would say pretty much everything except for the poles is habitable by something to some degree. Although it often remains just below ground except at night or except during the day. So if you don't go at the right time of day and really keep your eyes out, you may very well walk away thinking it's uninhabited. But you know, if you know what to look for, and if you were to look just below ground, you would see it's teeming with life everywhere. Are there zoos on Mars, and what can be seen in them? Yeah, there are zoos on Mars. There's a Neu-Berlin Zoo that has reproduction of the Zoologischer Garten in Berlin, the really famous, huge one. However, it has a lot of Martian wildlife, and also alien wildlife in general, and some preserved specimens from Earth, but not very many. Are there nature preserves for the local fauna? Probably within the Valles Marineris demilitarized zone. I imagine there are some nature reserves in some spots. I don't recall ever going to them, but I believe I remember hearing that they exist.
Is agriculture possible on the surface? Are any of the Earth animals raised there as cattle?
There have been experiments with agriculture on the surface. They have not been successful. There have been, as far as I know, no successful attempts at getting Earth crops to grow on Mars without very extreme genetic engineering, which also then changes the composition of the crops, which is not a good thing to fuck around with. So it's very difficult, if not really just impossible. And are any of the Earth animals raised there as cattle? Not that I know of. The breakaway, they do definitely eat meat. In fact, they probably eat more meat than we do per capita. However, they don't use, they don't slaughter animals for it. They consider that extremely barbaric. What they do is they grow it using cloned stem cells. So you won't really find like farmed meat. You will find hunted meat, interestingly. For whatever reason, it's fine to hunt your meat. and kill it in the wild. But of course that's, you know, expensive and you have to have a gun license and blah blah blah. But there is a hunting culture. But meat that you buy in a supermarket in the breakaway is grown in a lab from cloned stem cells.
Are there rats, cockroaches, and mosquitoes on Mars? Either local or Terran? How big can they grow there?
Rats and cockroaches follow wherever Terrans go. So yeah, there are rats and cockroaches. The biggest rat I've seen was about the size of a small sheep, and they have cockroaches that get to be about the size, probably about the size of a lobster. Yeah, they're really horrific critters. Fortunately, they do have really good pesticides and everything. But they are a problem, and I've never heard of mosquitoes on Mars. There's not really enough water for them to breed in most of Mars, so even if they did follow, they would die off before very long because they couldn't reproduce.
Is anyone terraforming Mars right now? What are the challenges for such a project?
The biggest challenge, well, there are many really big challenges. The biggest one is raising the temperature enough to where it's feasible for people to walk around and everything, like without wearing gear, because although even there are places on Mars where you can breathe just fine, but it's still really cold, and it's certainly not comfortable, and in most of it it's just not habitable, especially at night because of the cold. And there is also the issue of, like I mentioned, the soil composition, that you can't really grow things there, but on the other hand, if they were to terraform, then everything there would also probably die off. And so either way, it's requiring mass genetic engineering of both the flora and the fauna to create an entire new environment. However, there is a terraforming project ongoing by the Germans right now as we speak. It's expected to take probably at least about 200 years. It's going to be a long, long time. Why they don't just send people back in time 200 years and wake up tomorrow and find Mars like a paradise, I don't know. Maybe there are legal ramifications where they can't just do that, or something. Who knows? But yeah.
Is sun radiation a big impediment for the establishment of settlements, as many scientists say? Is it a big issue for the people who stay on the surface? Is it possible to open a hotel or a restaurant on the surface, for example?
No. No to the first part. That's one of the big lies we're told about Mars, is that it doesn't have a magnetosphere. It has a magnetosphere. If anything, it has less radiation because it's further away from the sun. That's not really a problem. Is it a big issue for the people to stay on the surface? No, really, no. Is it possible to open a hotel or a restaurant on the surface? Yeah. Yeah, you can do that. There is a pub on Mars that I'm quite fond of. It's called the Glass Hub. Kind of a lame name, but I am quite fond of it. It'll be in the book, by the way. And yeah, there are hot spring resorts and stuff in Valles Marineris because there are hot springs around there. Okay.
What travel tours are offered to the visitors on Mars? What do people come to do there?
They come to do all sorts of things, actually. A lot of people come, I just mentioned the hot spring resorts. A lot of people come to do those. A lot of people come to go to ski. That's a big business, is skiing. And skiing is more fun and probably somewhat more dangerous in the lighter gravity. People come to do a lot of adventure tourism in general, just out in the wilderness. And historical tourism is a big thing because of the various ruins and such. So yeah, you can do almost anything unless you want to go to the beach, then you have to go somewhere else.
And lastly, was the three-breasted hooker on Mars from the movie Total Recall part of the soft disclosure? Are there mutated humans like that?
Yes, but that's not Mars specific. That's a breakaway thing in general of making, in the brothels you will find really freaky genetically modified women and men, you know, for, you know, whatever you want. Yeah, that's a thing, but it's not Mars specific. Starting with some of the pictures, here we see some images of what Mars may have looked like in 45 when the ships started arriving. You can see down below the birds flying by and all that, and it looks quite peaceful. And here are these ships showing up to fuck all that up. And that they did. Here we see two soldiers walking in what looks like early morning light on the surface, judging by the style of guns, probably fairly early on in the occupation period. And also these are not super up-to-date suits either, so fairly early is what I would imagine the artist was inspired by. Whether they knew that or not, we'll probably never know, because I don't know who the artist is. But this is what these patrols looked like. Here we see one of the early images of modular living on the surface. As you can see, from the 40s or 50s probably, as you can see, the family are all wearing their suits because they had to wear their suits pretty much at all times. In that period, they had not yet realized that they needed to build underground, and can see they're trying to eke out an existence. It's not exactly super hospitable, but they're trying, and this is what it would have pretty much been like. Here we see an early attempt at building a city on the surface. This would not have lasted long. It would have been, especially since you can see there is a force field attempt, but again, it was quite crude in those days, in the 40s or 50s. And so eventually, the realization that they could not build any cities on the surface and have them last is what made them finally start looking to the underground. Here we see an image of an early underground settlement. You can see a lot of it has been carved out quite a long time ago. They did not build most of this stuff that was underground. It was cleared out of the indigenous, or the indigenous were cleared out of it. And they started moving in their modern implements. You can see it's still kind of rough and ready, let's say, but it was an improvement. You know, people could walk around it outside and breathe, and so this was an improvement. This would have probably been what it would have looked like in the late 50s or early to mid 60s. This is a not bad recreation of the Martian indigenous raptors, although they're a bit smoother than this picture makes them look, but it's still pretty decent. They are the people who've probably been the most persecuted, but they've also put up the most of a fight in all this. They're the only people who, their end of the treaty has not been honored at all. They are still being used for target practice by both the Americans and the Germans. In spite of what some people will tell you, the Americans are not the only people who are guilty in this case. But there's not actually a ton known about these guys. They're very territorial. They don't let other people in much, for what I think are pretty understandable reasons. Here we see some pretty remarkable plant life. You will find things like this in the so-called green belt, which is near the equator, and the center of the green belt, of course, is the Valles Marineris area. In total, it's about the size of Australia, so it's quite huge, actually, in proportion to Mars, and you can clearly see it on many satellite images of Mars. And you do indeed find these trees, or ones very similar to this. I don't know what their proper name is, of course, but yeah, there is really incredible beauty and greenery in some places. This is pretty much what the entrance way to the Neuberlin Volkshalle looks like. You can see it's megalithic. In fact, it's probably more than megalithic. It might be even like, what's the next size up from megalithic? Cyclopean in size. That's a new word for the day, cyclopean. So this is what the entryway looks like. This place was erected more or less at the end of the war. Here we see what looks like some teenagers perhaps trying to race their car up some sand dunes, you know, living normal life. This is a thing that does go on Mars, and which went on even during the war. You know, normal life happened just the same as it always has. People don't really change in that aspect. Here we see an individual coming in to inspect a settlement or city, wearing hazmat gear, by the way, which has been devastated by weaponry, probably either nuclear or chemical weaponry or simple bombs of some kind. Things have grown in. which is indicative of they usually wait 6 months to a year, depending on what weapon they used, before they come in and examine a settlement again. So this is, during the war, this would have been a very typical scene. Here we see some of the lightning storms on Mars. What's not commonly known is that it does indeed sometimes look like this. There is a phenomenon which is still not entirely understood, but it causes the lightning to contort and flex itself and form itself into these really remarkable shapes, just like in this image. It's really quite something to see sometimes. This looks a lot like that ship graveyard I mentioned earlier. I was quite shocked when I found this. But I talked about it earlier, so I don't need to really describe it too much again, but this is a not bad representation of what it looks like while you're there. Although the ships would be even larger and more alien looking for the most part. This is the closest I could get the AI to representing the signing of the Neu-Berlin Treaty in 1990. It would have been much bigger, of course, much more people. There would have been indigenous Martian humans and reptilians present. But this is not terrible, all told. It was indeed signed on the surface like this, actually, with the Germans wearing their environment suits, white ones to symbolize peace, just like in this picture. So this is what that would have looked like, and that finally ended the Black Terror.